Euodia and Syntyche were the best of friends.
No way! Not fair! Completely unacceptable! I won't allow it! Euodia, this level of cuteness should be illegal. Syntyche, call 911. I am dying from your cuteness.
They were always together.
What do we do all day long? Shine like stars, baby!
Visiting the sick.
Would you like me to read you a Bible story? Would you like me to make you some soup?
Feeding the hungry.
Hey, Euodia, want to help me make lunches for homeless people? Of course! I love doing good deeds.
And sharing the good news.
God can forgive you no matter what you've done. Yeah, even you, Doug.
But then things changed.
I just can't trust you anymore. You only think of yourself. I don't know why you can't let go of this. You think you're better than everyone else. We used to be such good friends. Why don't you notice all the ways I try to help? It's over.
So no one told you life was gonna be this way. Your job's a joke, you're broke. Your love life's the way. It's like you're always stuck in second gear, when it hasn't been your day, your week, your month, or even your year.
Could a letter from an old friend bring them back together?
I beg you, Euodia, and I beg you, Syntyche, to be of the same mind in the Lord. If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do everything without grumbling and arguing, then you will shine like stars in the sky. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure or lovely or admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about those things.
I'll be there for you when the rain starts to pour. I'll be there for you like I've been there before. I'll be there for you 'cause you're there for me too.
Philippians.
'Cause you're there for me too.
Hey, it's me. Please don't hang up.
Good morning, everybody. Before we get started, I'd like to invite Tessa and Tessa Claire to come up. All right. Tessa, I'm so glad you're here with us. Where's Tessa Claire? Oh, there she is. All right. All right. So thank you so much for helping us with that. Nice job. I kind of wish we had twins now. I don't know. I never wanted twins before we made that video. No, Sandy says no. All right. So we're starting our Philippians series today. By the way, I'm Kirk. I'm not the regular preacher. I sit over there. But every now and then I get to present some scripture to you. And I'm happy to do that this morning and happy to kick off our Philippians series. And what I want to do this morning is sort of give you what I think is the broad lay of the land in the book of Philippians. And then Doug can, the next few weeks, sort of fill in some of the details of some texts that we're not going to get to go into in depth this morning. So we're doing big picture survey. Unlike the last time I preached when I spent like an hour and a half on 3 verses, I'll do 3 chapters today. And I don't know, we'll be done by supper. All right, so you might not know the names Euodia and Syntyche, or those names might not have ever stuck out to you in your Bible reading. And if they haven't, there's a good reason for that. They only show up in 1 verse in the book of Philippians. And other than this 1 verse, we really don't know anything about them. And you can get the gist of that verse based on the Philippians trailer that we saw this morning. Paul, as he's writing his letter and moving toward the end, says, I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, whoever that is, Epaphroditus, if I were betting, but I don't know. I ask you, my true companion, help these women since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. And the truth is, although we had to imagine some things to make that trailer, in reality, we don't know much of anything about Euodia and Syntyche. I don't know how old they were when this letter was written. I don't know how long they had been Christians. I don't know exactly what their role is in laboring, contending for the gospel alongside of Paul. I don't know what has led to this disagreement between them. I know they are faithful Christians. I know Paul considers them co-workers who contended by his side, so they worked side by side with Paul in his mission to spread the gospel. I know they certainly know each other well and have spent a lot of time doing good work together for the kingdom, and I know that something has led them to drift apart. My suspect is it's not a doctrinal disagreement or not a serious one, because I don't think Paul would hesitate to tell them which one is right and to move the other one back onto the path of correct doctrine. But there's something that doesn't have to do with the core of the gospel or who Jesus is or anything like that, where they don't see eye to eye, and it's causing them to drift apart. Now, I will tell you, the way I read Philippians is not the way everybody reads Philippians. So you should just know you have a choice. You can read Philippians the way your good friend Kirk does, or the way the majority of Bible PhDs do. When I say it that way, that sounds like one of those should be obvious. But I'm telling you, the more I read Philippians, the more I'm convinced that this conflict between 2 women who Paul knows very well, who have labored with Paul in the gospel, who have worked for him alongside of him, ministered with him, who have bonded with him, and who now are at odds. The more I read Philippians, the more I am convinced that this conflict between his 2 friends is on his mind throughout much of the book. And if you go back and read Philippians from the start, knowing that toward the end of the book he will beg, and the word in Greek is really strong. He is begging Euodia, and I beg you, Syntyche, to agree with each other. Once you know of that conflict, read Philippians from the start, and you start to notice that this seems to be on his mind. You'll notice, for example, that early on in the letter, Paul writes, in all my prayers for you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel. Well, who's been partnering in the gospel with him? From the first day until now, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion in the day of Jesus. Or then, knowing that these 2 women are at odds, doesn't this seem significant? at the end of chapter 1, verse 27, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in the one Spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. And then as you move into chapter 2, you begin to hear this emphatic, this pleading tone for unity from Paul. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and one in mind. And then right after this, he tells them, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. And you may start to wonder if maybe this conflict between Euodia and Syntyche has something to do with personal ambition, maybe competing visions for the ministry in Philippi, and that suspicion may go stronger as you read chapter 2 and see how Paul describes his current co-workers, Timothy and Epaphroditus, and you notice the qualities he commends in them. Of Timothy, he says, I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare. For everyone looks out for their own interest, not those of Jesus Christ. But not Timothy. He looks out for Jesus, even at the cost of what might be best or easiest for himself. And when we get to Epaphroditus, Paul says quite frankly, he risked his life to make up for the help you yourselves could not give me. Over and over in the first 2 chapters, be of like mind, fight together. I want you to honor the gospel by being as one person fighting for it. And do you notice my co-workers, how they're not vain, they're not conceited, they don't look for their own interest, they look out for Jesus, and they look out for you. Paul's not quite saying, why can't you be more like your big brothers? But it's close. See how Timothy doesn't fight for his own interest? Hint, Euodia. See how Epaphroditus almost died because of his eagerness to serve the church? Hint, Syntyche. Don't you remember this is our attitude when we do ministry for the Lord, that it was never about us, our ambition, our goals, our dreams. It's always about Jesus and the church. We love God, we love our neighbors. You have to remember, of course, that unlike in the movie trailer, and you know, Hollywood never quite gets the Bible story right. Unlike in the movie trailer, Euodia and Syntyche don't have mailboxes. And Paul doesn't have a Xerox machine, and they don't get individual copies of the letter. What happens is somebody, probably Epaphroditus, carries the letter from where Paul is in prison to the church in Philippi. And when he arrives there, he sends word to all the Christians in Philippi, I bring you news from your friend, the Apostle Paul. Gather together. And they have a gathering, and somebody, probably, if I were betting, Epaphroditus, but somebody stands up and reads the letter. In church to everybody. And here's Euodia sitting on the front row, because she knows that's closest to heaven. And here's Syntyche on the other side of the church, sitting on the front row to set a good example for other people. And can't you just imagine them sort of blushing and squirming as all of this language about fight as one person, agree with each other, don't be conceited, look after each other's interests. Oh, I think Paul's talking about us. I think he's talking about us. And they're sort of glancing at each other embarrassedly about this conflict that has become so big that their friend Paul in prison has to address it. And then they get to chapter 4, and now there's no denying what Paul has in mind. I beg you, Euodia, I beg you, Syntyche, have one mind in the Lord. There's been an elephant in the room, and he names it. And not only does he call them out publicly, he recruits somebody to help them get along. I ask you, my true companion, help these women who have contended at my side in the gospel. That them coming to agreement in the Lord is so important, I am not just going to tell them in front of everybody, y'all need to figure out how to get along together. You, loyal companion, I'm putting you in charge of making sure this reconciliation happens. Hardly ever in a church service when the preacher calls somebody by name and says, get your act together. Although, I should have brought my list. This would be a good morning to do it. But it's what Paul does. Not because he hates them or not because he wants to embarrass them, but because this conflict must be dealt with. So there are some scholars who don't think it's plausible that a conflict between two women at a church in the first century could be so critical to the health and vitality of the early church that Paul would spend most of his letter thinking about it. There are scholars who believe that this mention of Euodia and Syntyche is sort of an aside in a letter that basically must be about something else. They usually have trouble telling you what they think that thing is. I read like 3 Philippians commentaries that all said, well, here's 7 possible purposes for the letter. Because if it's not mainly about Euodia and Syntyche, then the letter seems to kind of wander around. But if it is mainly about this conflict, then suddenly you start seeing this trajectory of thought. I will tell you why I think scholars, some of them, we will call them the wrong ones, don't think this conflict is as important as I think it is. It's because they have spent more time in the classroom than they have in their churches. This is my theory. Because if you're in the classroom and you're used to dealing with sort of academic theology, and you read this letter, well, there's no huge doctrinal conflict. I don't know why Paul writes this letter. If you're looking for some heresy in the letter, like in Galatians or Colossians, you're not going to find it there. And you may just kind of skip over this interpersonal conflict. If you have spent your life doing ministry, either on staff or as a dedicated volunteer in churches, and you read about 2 dedicated, godly women who have served the cause of the gospel out in the mission field, and they don't agree, I think you're like me and you go back and say, oh. As when I read, I beg you, Euodia, and I beg you, Syntyche, y'all have to be of one mind in the Lord. I have lived that story. I've lived it. Good people, Christian people, wanting to do the right thing, loving Jesus, dedicated to his cause with different ideas about what that is supposed to look like in practical ways in the church. And wanting to honor God and wanting to do the right thing and not wanting to be jerks or evil or proud about it, but deeply convinced of their own way and find themselves at loggerheads. In Philippi, it's Euodia and Syntyche. No one names their kids that anymore, although if you have twins, in my life, the names weren't Euodia and Syntyche. They were Carol and Bob. They were Rick and Stephen. They were Stephanie and Heather. Good people, loving people, Christian people could not agree. And man, I've got stories. Lots of stories. I'll tell you one. Back when I was a baby preacher, I was a fetus. It was the summer of '93. I was between my junior and senior year of college. Bible major, Abilene Christian University. I interned for the summer at a church in Amarillo, Texas, where my hero was one of the ministers on staff. A man who had come and held gospel meetings at my little church when I was like 11 and 12 years old. And when I was 5, I said I wanted to be a preacher. But when I heard this man speak, I'll just use his real name because he'll never hear this, Lyndon. When I heard Lyndon speak, I said, I want to be a preacher like Lyndon. I've just turned 20. I'm interning at Lyndon's church. I am working with the man himself. This is like, I was such a preacher groupie. If you're a football fan, this is like you're interning with J.J. Watt. Seriously, I get to work with the best preacher I've ever heard. Now, the church that he was a minister at was a merger of 2 pre-existing congregations. This doesn't happen very often, but sometimes churches try this. Lyndon's church was about 150 people in attendance. Rick was the other minister. His congregation was about 100. Same denomination, agreed with each other on a lot, same town. Said, hey, let's combine forces and have a church of 250. And one of the buildings would easily hold that many. And so they merge. Things are going great. These folks love each other. They're worshiping together. They go through that transition phase. Here's the difficulty. Lyndon is 50 years old, master's degree, been a preacher his whole life. Rick, on the other hand, is 50 years old, master's degree, been a preacher his whole life. There's no natural ranking here. There's not like an obvious senior minister. But we're Christians. We're all Christians. We love Jesus. We will just work together. It'll work out fine. Lyndon, you'll be in charge of the preaching and teaching program. Rick, you'll be in charge of like outreach and personal ministries, the men's program, the women's program, the youth stuff. You do all the people stuff. Lyndon, you do administration and preach and teach, which really naturally fit these men's natural gifts. And they're like, great, Rick's happy to not have to preach anymore. Lyndon's happy to not have to act nice. And so this is going fine. And then one day, Rick has an idea. He wants to bring in a new teaching program for the youth that he thinks would be a great teaching program. And like announces at the elders and ministers meeting, hey, I'm going to start this new program next month. And Lyndon says, hold on a second. I'm in charge of preaching, teaching. And I'm not trying to lord it over you, but teaching is my area of responsibility, and you're talking about a new teaching program, and I'm not convinced this is the program we need. And Rick says, well, it's a youth-focused program, and I'm in charge of ministry to youth, so this should really be my area. I said, well, not when it comes to Sunday morning teaching. The Sunday morning thing is mine, and they're at loggerheads. I love both these men. Love them dearly. And they can't agree. And this conflict is happening while I'm an intern. Boy, that was fun. And so eventually, they're just kind of going at it, and never can come to agreement. So, you know what they decide to do? I don't know if they thought of it in these terms. They decide to get a loyal companion. Let's let somebody else sort this out for us. They go to the elders, say, okay, Rick wants to do this program. He thinks it's his call because it's youth related. Lyndon thinks it's his decision because it's teaching related. They both have a good point. Elders, tell us. You either make the decision for us or tell us who gets to make this decision. But we're trying and we just can't get past this thing. And the elders pray about it and pass the ball back to them. No, you guys decide. A couple months later, Lyndon decides, and y'all, I know this seems like it shouldn't be a big deal, but it's one of those things that became a big deal. Lyndon decides to step down and just let the church continue under one unified vision for ministry, but he can't tell anybody that's why he's stepping down because he doesn't want any backlash against Rick. But Lyndon was a really great preacher, and Rick was like really nice. And the folks who were used to Lyndon's preaching got pretty antsy with Rick being really nice, and he kind of got shoved out over a conflict between two good people that they could not resolve, who tried to do everything the right way, even thinking, I will self-sacrificially move myself out of this picture to let things continue on. The church lost both of its ministers, and this becomes a really long story, but 15 years later, that congregation didn't exist. Went from 250 to nothing. Folded up, sold the building. And I am convinced that the thing that led to that ultimate demise of that church was Euodia and Syntyche, Lyndon and Rick, wonderful people, working in the gospel, love each other, could not be of the same mind in the Lord. And when two people deeply involved in the ministry of the church can't see eye to eye, and with all good intentions and love can't work it out, it's deadly. And at this point in the life of the church, first century church, when the people who have worked beside the Apostle Paul in spreading the gospel and are now important figures of the church in Philippi can't see eye to eye, Paul understands how precarious this is. All right, I'm halfway through my notes and I have 7 minutes. We can do this. So Paul gives them these words. After the I beg Euodia and I beg Syntyche, he moves into this admonition. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. When I was a teenager in the 1800s, and preachers preached Philippians 4:8, whatever is good, pure, noble, admirable, the usual application was to R-rated movies. Some of y'all heard this sermon? All right, don't go watch R-rated movies, because you need to think about what's pure and admirable and good and noble and praiseworthy, and R-rated movies are not that. Okay, that's a fine lesson. Christians need to be careful about the media they consume. I'm completely on board with that. But I think coming just after this begging Euodia and begging Syntyche, what Paul probably has in mind is whatever is true, pure, noble, admirable, good, lovely, praiseworthy in the people around you. Would you please focus on that? Would you look for the good in each other? What he's thinking about is the person who is currently driving you batty. The person in the next office, your brother-in-law, the person you nod at but don't speak to Sunday morning at church. Do they say anything true? Do they do anything right? Are they lovely in any way? Are they admirable in any way? What about them could you commend? What could you learn from? He's a loving father. And the way he parents his kids, boy, we disagree, but I could learn some of that. You know what? She works really hard as a volunteer. And I got to hand it to her. Man, she's there when we need her. He gave so generously to meet an important need. When it was time to step up, he emptied his pockets, and that made a difference for somebody. We don't always agree, but wow, she loves the scriptures. I could use some of that. Maybe she could show me how to read my Bible more deeply. Maybe if I could just drop my shields and reach out. I skipped over the heart of this letter before. Remember in Colossians, we talked about the hymn, the poem, song that Paul gives the Colossians to keep their theology straight. Paul does the same thing in Philippians. He gives them a hymn in chapter 2. And the hymn goes like this. He introduces it by saying, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Jesus Christ. Be of one mind in the Lord. See this repeated language? And the song goes, who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Theology drives behavior. I am deeply convinced of that. What I believe about God, what I worship, is going to change who I am. If you worship a hateful and vindictive God, you will become a hateful and vindictive person. If you worship a God who is nearly impossible to please, you will become nearly impossible to please. If your God doesn't really care about humanity, there's no reason for you to care either. But if your God, if the Lord you serve has all power, all privilege, is co-equal with God the Father, but humbles himself to become a person, to become a servant to others, to become obedient even to the point of death, well then the privileges and powers and prerogatives and positions that I have, I'm going to start to hold with an increasingly loose grip to take on the servant nature of Christ and to bless those around me. Because if the God I worship gives up power and privilege to be a servant, slowly, moment by moment, I will learn to do the same. Paul gives them an application for this song. Philippians 2:12, therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and act in order to fulfill his good purpose. That line, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, is one that I think gets misread quite a bit. Sometimes it gets preached with the wrong preposition. Right? I've heard this sermon where it's preached as though Paul says, work for your salvation with fear and trembling. Better stack up those good deeds. You can never be sure that you've done enough to be saved. Keep working for your salvation with fear and trembling because you're afraid that if you don't do enough good stuff, you will go to hell. There are two problems with that interpretation of that verse. One is it's heretical. I find to be a small problem, right? Because we know that the grace of God has covered us, that it's not about earning anything, that God's grace is free and sure, and for those who have come to believe in him, our salvation is guaranteed. We are not working for it, and if we tried to work for it, we could never earn it. We only trust in the righteousness of Christ. The other problem, besides the fact that it's heretical, is just it gets the grammar wrong, because it's not work for your salvation, it's work out your salvation. You're saved, God's grace is sure, so now live out the consequences of your salvation. Work out the implications of the cross in your own relationships. Take the attitude of Jesus and apply that in your life. Work out your salvation. Act like Jesus. Act like one of the saved. And what about the fear and trembling bit? At the end of our silly little video, there's a part where Yodia calls Syntyche, or maybe the other way around. I get them mixed up. They look so much alike. And Syntyche answers the phone and hears Yodia say, "It's me. Please don't hang up." Now, I don't know about you guys. Sometimes I get emotionally connected to media. Even though I made that silly video and edited the thing, to hear that little voice say, please don't hang up. And you know why it gets me? Because I know how hard those calls are. I know how tough that is. It's easier to stay silent, easier to just live with that ongoing tension, easier to just let things simmer rather than risk them coming to a boil, easier to apologize, to wait for the other person to apologize first, to change first, to come to see your point of view first. And yet the way of Jesus is to deny privilege, let go of power, disregard position, humbly serve, even to the point of death. And if Jesus can die for me, surely I can write that apology. Surely I can send a note. Surely I can invite that person to lunch. Surely I can make that call, and my fingers might tremble as I punch in that number, and my heart might sink with fear of how I'll be received. But Jesus died for me. I can have a difficult conversation for him. I can humble myself and work out my salvation and my relationships with others with fear and trembling. For some of you, there is a face in your head right now. You know who you need to reconcile with. You know who you need to apologize to. You know who you have been avoiding. And you also know that if you don't do something soon, that urgent feeling within your heart as the words of Scripture sink in will begin to slip away, and you'll go back to the stalemate that you're in right now. So let me offer you this word of exhortation. Before you go to bed tonight, here's your goal. Before you go to bed tonight, write the rough draft of your letter to that person. Write your email. Get something down on paper. And then, as you write it, be gentle and rejoice. Look for anything good or commendable or praiseworthy about that other person. Think about any way that they've been an example to you of the goodness of God, and adopt the servant spirit of Christ. Look after their best interests, not your own. All these admonitions from Philippians. And then once you have that note, pray over it. And pray over it on Monday and Tuesday. If you need to edit it, ask for wisdom and grace from the Spirit as you edit your note, and pray over it on Thursday and Friday. And by Saturday night, before you go to bed, mail a physical note, hit send on that email, send that text, make that call before you gather in worship next Sunday morning. If you let this week go by and don't do it, it'll be 5 years and you won't do it. But this is the week. This is the week to hear the call. Yodi is not bad. Syntyche is not bad. But they don't see eye to eye. And Paul calls them to do what it takes to have the same mind in the Lord by denying privilege and position and humbling themselves. Nothing about that is easy. Welcome to Christianity. And remember, it's not all on you. It is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose.